Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. In every era of history, spies have been issued special equipment to do their jobs. Some of it is high-tech, some of it is down and dirty. But that purpose-built gear is a force multiplier. So, how do you like to get your hands on some? Our friends at Covert Products Group make a wide range of tools out of unconventional materials like titanium, G10, carbon fiber, and even 3D printed stock. These tools are designed for utility, concealment, and escape. What really sets their tools apart is that you can travel just about anywhere with them, legally. They call their travel-friendly line the BAT Collection, short for Bring Anywhere Tools. They're up to 3 or 4 designs at this point, and I heard that there are more in the works. Many of their products are OSS and SOE inspired, but made with the modern world in mind. They also release small runs of self-defense oriented products from time to time. Good stuff. You can find them online at covertproductsgroup.com. I'd recommend signing up for their email list while you're there, and I know they won't spam you. Once again, that's covertproductsgroup.com, and use the promo code SPYCRAFT101 at checkout for free shipping in the US. This is episode number 14 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today, I'm joined by Helena Merriman, an award-winning journalist and producer with the British Broadcasting Corporation. Helena has just written a new book called Tunnel 29, based on her very popular 10-part podcast of the same name, which tells an incredible story of courage, commitment, resistance, and love in Cold War Berlin. As soon as I learned about Tunnel 29, I knew that I had to get Helena on the podcast to share this incredible story. So Helena, thank you so much for coming on today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure, absolutely. For starters, can you tell us a little bit about your work and what it is that drew you to the story of Tunnel 29 in the first place?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist at the BBC, and I think really what drew me to this story was my experiences being a reporter all over the world for the BBC, mostly in the Middle East. And in many of the countries that I was reporting in, governments were either building walls or had barriers that ran along the borders of their countries or within cities. And I came across a statistic, which is that over 70 countries in the world, so that's a third of all countries now, have some kind of wall or barrier. And there's a lot that's been written about the politics of those walls. But what I was really interested in was what happens when you build a wall? How does it change a country or a city and its people? And, you know, what is the mother of all walls? The Berlin Wall. And the story about this particular escape tunnel that I've written about in the book, it tells us so much, not only about the Berlin Wall, but also about the Stasi, the East German secret police force, and it even takes us into the birth of TV. So although this incredible tunnel escape happened back in the 1960s, it felt very much like a story for our times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a fascinating story about intentionally dividing a culture and a people, which I think is very relevant in a lot of ways today. And one thing that is really fascinating to me is how unexpected it apparently was. How was it that the wall was built so quickly and so secretly in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question. I still think of it as one of the most audacious plots a government has ever carried out against its own people. So Walter Albrecht, he was the mastermind behind it, the leader of East Germany. And the reason he wanted to build a wall was to solve a huge problem he had, which was that his country was falling apart because so many people were leaving, because they were sick of the very controlling government, the censorship, not much choice in the shops, very little choice about how you would live. And so by 1961, around a third of people in East Germany had left, 3 million people. And so he comes up with this idea to build a wall, essentially to lock them in. And he knows that to do it, he has to do it very quickly and surreptitiously. So he plans this months before he actually does it. He buys in barbed wire, not just from factories in East Germany, but as far as West Germany and also Great Britain, so that people in East Germany wouldn't know what he was up to. And then he hardly tells anyone. There are no phone calls about it, no letters about it. Only a handful of his advisors know what he's up to. And he picks this date in the middle of August, Saturday the 12th of August, to do it. It's the date of the annual children's fair. So in East Berlin, there are kids out in the street eating ice cream and they're watching fireworks. And unknown to them at that very moment, there are these tanks rumbling towards East Berlin, ready to cut off anyone who tries to escape. Fort Albrecht is holding a garden party. He's invited all his ministers there and no one can work out why they're there. And that's when he tells them, he says, right, I'm closing the border. I'm building this wall. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, the street lights in East Berlin are all switched off. He doesn't want anyone seeing what they're about to do. And over the next 6 hours, you have soldiers driving around to the various border crossings between East and West Berlin. And they pull out these coils of barbed wire and they string them up between concrete posts, pound them into the ground, and they construct this barbed wire fence so that, the next day people wake up, the city's workers are up first, and they wake up to find their city is suddenly divided, and they're stuck on one side of the barrier, and perhaps their children or their wives or their sisters or brothers are stuck on the other side.
That's so hard for us to imagine. I honestly didn't realize that this was essentially one man's plot that he put together himself, but I really can't imagine that immediate loss of freedom of movement and being separated from your family members that just went across yesterday, for example. I think I've even read that there were people like women giving birth in a hospital, East German women giving birth in a hospital in West Germany, and suddenly they were cut off from the family. Is that right?
That's right. There are these heartbreaking stories of East Berlin mothers who lived in East Berlin, who perhaps given birth a few nights before. Some of them had children, some of them had babies that needed specialist medical care. So they were in hospitals in West Berlin. The mothers had then gone home for the night, ready to cross the border to go back to see their babies. And they were suddenly cut off.
Oh my gosh.
And so, there are accounts of families who never saw each other again. And there are there are some extraordinary photos from the day, the 13th of August, when these families woke up to suddenly find this barbed wire fence. And there are photos of women holding their babies or holding their children up to their grandparents on the other side, and even photos of the dreaded VOPOs, the border guards, holding back 4 5-year-old children who are desperately trying to jump over the barbed wire to be with their parents, but these border guards are holding them back. And there were hundreds of these children who were then left in East Berlin without their parents, who were then sent to orphanages or foster homes. And by the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, some of them never saw their parents again.
My God, that is completely incredible. I didn't realize that, honestly. It orphaned children just by stringing up that fence so that they were within shouting distance, essentially, but didn't get to see them again. I didn't realize that, honestly. That's horrible. So did people react?
It is.
Did people react more with anger or despondency or what exactly? Was there any demonstrations against the new wall at the time of its construction?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a bit of both. There are, again, reports. So for the book, I trawled through radio reports from Radio in the American Sector, which was this American radio station that was the very powerful tool of the Cold War. And they had reporters going around describing what they were seeing. And some of the descriptions are of people entirely despondent who were just reduced to waving to people on the other side. And then they also describe these crowds of mostly men who would gather at the border and start shouting and protesting at the border guards, who would eventually shoot at them with tear gas to disperse them. Or even on the West Berlin side, because they were just as aggrieved about this barbed wire, these groups of men on motorbikes that would drive towards the border until they were pushed back by West Berlin policemen who didn't want a confrontation at the border. And what's fascinating is, so the escapes begin that very day. So the day the Berlin Wall goes up, 800 people escape. And what's remarkable is that quite a few of them are the construction workers. So these people who were effectively building the walls of their own prison. When the backs of their supervisors are turned, they take their chance and they dash out and they run into West Berlin. Quite a few border guards even escape. Quite a few politicians even escape that day. Or you have these groups of families who assemble by the barbed wire and suddenly chuck over their suitcases and jump onto the other side. So people are very, very desperate at that stage and willing to do anything. And some even fling themselves out of the fourth floor windows on some of these flats and apartments right next to the wall. And some of them are caught by firemen holding nets on the West Berlin side.
Wow. So there is immediately some support, hasty support, I guess, improvised support on the West German side with the firefighters to begin with. Does that spread quickly as well?
Yeah, it does. And soon these escape attempts become even more sophisticated. So you have people in those apartments that abutted the wall. They would write down on a piece of paper the apartment they were in and the floor number and which window, and they would throw it out maybe 3 or 4 days before they were planning to jump, hoping that someone in West Berlin would take that piece of paper with the details and would assemble some firemen with a fire net, and then they would jump at the appointed day, the appointed hour from the window. And, some of them made it, some of them didn't. One woman called Ida Siekmann, she jumped and there was no net. And she died, and she was one of the first people to die trying to escape. But yes, to your question, that news spread very fast, and you had also very quickly lots of cameramen and news crew realizing what a huge story this was, and they would assemble along the barbed wire, filming and taking photographs of people jumping. And that's why probably a lot of people will recognize, will be familiar with that very iconic photograph of a border guard jumping over the barbed wire, who's called Hans Conrad Schumann. And that was just a few days after the barbed wire went up. And a photographer was just waiting for a picture, for anything interesting to happen, saw this border guard about to jump, took a picture of him as he was leaping over the barbed wire, his arms outstretched as though he was in flight. And that picture became the front pages of newspapers all over the world and is now one of the most iconic photographs from that time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that one for sure. And that's such an indictment of the system that its own enforcers are trying to escape as well, especially like the construction workers you mentioned and the politicians. So it seems to me that I understand why this decision was made to keep people from getting out, but the optics were so bad for the government. I can't imagine that this did anything to improve things for their position or for their people or anything like that.
Absolutely. And this is why one of the fascinating things I discovered while researching this book was that it wasn't the Soviet Union who came up with this idea of building the wall. It was very much an East German solution. It was Walter Ulbricht's idea. And in fact, when he put it to Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, he at first was appalled because he knew that if they were to build a wall to stop people escaping the so-called communist paradise, that would be a PR disaster. They're right at that time in the middle of the Cold War, trying to persuade the world that communism was better than capitalism. And yet here they are building a wall to lock people in. So you're absolutely right. It was highly embarrassing. And it was highly embarrassing that you had politicians defecting and border guards defecting. And interestingly, one of the policies that Walter Ulbricht introduces is that he hires a lot of these border guards from outside Berlin. So Hans Conrad Schumann, that border guard who leapt over the barbed wire, he was a shepherd from the countryside that had been brought in because Ulbricht thought those border guards from the countryside would be less soft on Berliners because they had no skin in the game, they didn't really know anyone. But he misjudged it with this particular border guard.
Okay, I see. And so obviously the people of East Berlin were caught unaware, but what about the Western governments and Western intelligence agencies? Were they also blindsided by the construction of this wall? And once it went up, how did they actually react officially and diplomatically?
Yeah, completely blindsided. What was interesting was that American spy agencies various American informants had taken photographs of these building materials, collecting at various points along the border. And someone even wrote in one of the files in one of these reports, this looks like building material for a wall. But that idea was quickly discounted because they thought, that's just crazy. No one could want to do, no one could have the idea of doing something so ambitious. And so when the barbed wire appeared, they were taken completely by surprise. And even though you had something like 70 intelligence agencies all working inside Berlin, none of them knew that this was about to happen. And the date that Ulbricht had picked was perfect because not only were East Berliners away on holiday. You had President Charles de Gaulle on holiday at his country house in France. You had the Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Macmillan, was out grouse shooting. President Kennedy was out in Cape Cod on his cabin cruise of the Marlin. So all of them were just off holidaying and had absolutely no idea that they were suddenly going to be faced with making policy decisions on this barbed wire that would suddenly appear on the 13th of August.
Wow, was that by luck or was that by design on his part, picking that day when no one would be able to effectively respond?
Oh, very much by design. I mean, I think he mostly had the East Berliners in mind when he first came up with that date, because he knew they'd be on holiday, fewer people to make trouble in case anyone saw them putting up this barrier. But that decision proved absolutely right when it came to the international decisions that were being made at that time, because Kennedy took a very, very, very long time to respond. And his delay, his hesitancy, his dithering gave Walter Albrecht the confidence to go ahead and turn that barbed wire into a huge concrete monstrosity that became the Berlin Wall as we know it today.
So that's looking at the big picture, but I know that most of your book and your podcast as well, they focus on the smaller picture with one of these young men who was affected and his response to it. So can you tell us a little bit about him and how you chose to focus on him and his work?
Yeah, so the main character really in this book is a man called Joachim Rudolph, who is still alive today, and I've spent many, many hours over the last few years interviewing him at his apartment in Berlin. And he's extraordinary for so many reasons. I mean, his life starts off in a very unusual and difficult way, in that at the age of 6, he's this scrawny boy. He grows up on a farm in East Germany, and he wakes up one day to find his father packing up as many things as he can onto a horse and cart. And, you know, what he doesn't know, what his father can't tell him, is that they're on the run from the Russians, because Germany has just been divided. It's the dying days of the Second World War, and the Russian soldiers are rampaging through East Germany, coming to take the land that is now theirs after East Germany was divided. So they escape. Joachim's father is taken away by the Russians. He never sees them again. And Joachim eventually ends up in Berlin. He grows up there. He actually said he loved growing up in post-World War II Berlin because it was like an adventure playground. He would play hide and seek in these old bombed out buildings and find old explosives and throw them onto tram tracks. And then through his eyes, I explore how you suddenly then go from Berlin at the end of the Second World War, being led by the Nazis, to becoming part of this new Stalinist East German country. And Joachim, at the age of 22 years old, the wall then goes up. He decides to escape. And one night he crawls through a field with his best friend Manfred and makes it to West Berlin. And what I found so fascinating about him was that you might expect that someone having just escaped a very brutal regime, having made it to the promised land of West Berlin, you might expect that they would then want to put their feet up and make a new life and just enjoy it. But instead, his is the refugee story that you don't hear so often, which is that the promised land isn't what he'd hoped. He finds living there difficult. He finds the freedom almost too much. He doesn't understand what to do with it. And he makes friends with a group of East Berlin students. And together they hatch this plan to dig a tunnel under the wall, digging back into the country they've just escaped to rescue other people who want to escape just like they did. Wow.
First of all, I'm kind of surprised that he didn't find things to be as rosy as he had hoped. But I guess that's a story that happens to a lot of people for sure. But going back under, I mean, at this point, are people already being shot and people already being imprisoned for trying to cross the wall illegally? I mean, this obviously is a very risky plan that they're hatching right here.
Yeah, exactly. So by that stage, dozens of people had already been killed. Some of them killed jumping out of the window trying to escape. One man, guy called Gunther Litvin, he was a tailor. He was shot in the river trying to escape in the River Spree. People were getting very, very desperate, and it was getting harder to escape. So the kinds of methods that had worked back in September, October 1961, just after the barbed wire came up, you know, they were very crude. There were some people who just drove at the wall in dump trucks and smashed their way through. There was a couple who pushed their baby in a bathtub through the River Spree to get to the other side. There was a circus performer who who walked across, tight-roped his way across on a cable. And then there were the fake passport methods too, but gradually it got harder and harder and harder and more risky. And so they decided in March 1962, so the wall's been up by about 8 months at that point, that a tunnel was their best chance.
Okay. Did any of these guys have any experience or talent or capacity or anything to do this? Or were they just young men, young people full of hope and coming up with what they thought was the best idea at the time and improvising?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, so to their advantage, quite a few of them were engineering students, which meant that they could borrow things like theodolites from the university engineering department, which would help them work out where to go. But most of them had no idea how to build a real tunnel. And I remember when I asked Joachim this, he said, yeah, we didn't know what we were doing. It's not like people walked around with bollards around their necks saying, this is how you build an escape tunnel. He said they would literally just watch TV news and look for footage of other tunnels that had fallen in, because they weren't the first to try a tunnel. Others had tried digging tunnels, and a lot of them collapsed. A lot of them just got full of water. A lot of them were infiltrated by Stasi spies, and some of them were demolished by the border guards who were always patrolling on the lookout for tunnels, and they would have listening devices. And if they heard any sounds of digging underneath their feet, they would dig open the ground underneath them and they would throw in dynamite. And around the time that Joachim and the others start digging a tunnel, there is a group of tunnelers who were infiltrated by a Stasi informant, and the Stasi shot one of them and interrogates him as he lies there dying. So, the risks were horrible. The risks were drowning, being buried alive, being shot at, or being discovered by the Stasi and sent to prison. So the risks were huge.
Wow. Did Joachim have anyone back home? I know that he was specifically intending to rescue, or did he just want to help his fellow Berliners any way that he could?
Yeah, well, this is what's so interesting about him. He didn't. So, and I remember when I first started interviewing him, I remember thinking, oh gosh, how will anyone identify with him? Because it's not like he was trying to rescue his wife or his mother or his son or his sister. But I think that's what intrigued me about him, that he had, in a way, he had no skin in the game. And I think partly, and this is what, again, I find so interesting about East Germany in the story, that whenever I would ask him about this, and whenever I would say, but, look, Joachim, you didn't have to risk your life for these people. You didn't even know them. He said, well, you have to understand. He said, I grew up in East Germany, and though there were lots of things that I didn't like about it, there was a great sense of camaraderie and friendship and doing things for your brothers. And he said, so when I went to West Berlin, the minute I knew that there were other people trying to get out, of course I would help them, because we were brought up being told that that's what you should do. And I found that such a great irony, that it was the very values that East Germany had encouraged in the people that lived there that then helped to undermine it by someone like Joachim being inspired by those values to go and dig a tunnel under the wall to help people escape East Germany.
Well, I'm sure the irony was lost on the East German government there, but that's wonderful that people like him were able to get out and then go back and be so selfless in this whole situation. It just really shines a wonderful light on humanity, honestly.
It does.
So how exactly did they build this tunnel? How did they avoid the pitfalls, so to speak, of the other tunnels that collapsed and flooded and everything?
This is where it really turns into like the plot of a heist movie, and it feels very Ocean's 11 at this point. So when I was asking him how he did this, he said, right, so, it all began with maps, and we got some from the local Berlin government authorities, and we pored over them looking for the right place to dig where we wouldn't dig into the water table. And they gradually find somewhere where the soil isn't too crumbly, so where it won't collapse on them. They chart a route out where they're not going to dig too close to the city's electric lines or the tram lines. And they're very, very brave in that they choose to dig under a street called Bernauer Strasse, which is the road that the Berlin Wall divides in two. And the reason that's so gutsy to start digging it under that particular street is that it's patrolled by border guards all the time. So it means right from the start, they are digging right under the noses of these border guards. So they have to be very, very careful, and they draw up a very careful schedule so that no one will see them going in and out of this particular cellar. And they get into they're very organized about it. They get into a very neat schedule. They even draw up a schedule which sits that's on the wall of the cellar. They dig for 8-hour shifts. They have one person at the front scooping out. You have to lie on your back and scooping out the earth, pushing the spade into the earth in front of them with their feet, and then putting all that earth onto a cart. And then the cart would go whizzing down the tunnel and get pulled up by a pulley system. And then all the earth would be dumped into the cellar, and then it would begin again. And what I loved about Joachim was that he's a real electrical whiz kid. So any problem that they would encounter, he would find a way of solving. So when they start running out of fresh air, when they're digging right at the front of the tunnel, he comes up with a very clever plan of hooking together lots of pipes to bring fresh air in. When it gets too dark, he strings up this beautiful glowing set of electric lights. When the tunnel gets so long that he can't communicate with the rest of the team back in the cellar, he goes and buys an old World War II telephone from an army shop in West Berlin, and he puts one end of it at the front of the tunnel, the other end back in the cellar, so they can always communicate with each other. And so it becomes the most high-tech tunnel under the Berlin Wall, and he's very, very proud of it.
Oh, I can imagine. This sounds like already a much better planned operation than a lot of the other ones that failed, that were just people that were motivated but unaware of what they were doing, I guess.
Absolutely. And, whenever the few times he did see other tunnels, he was always quite amazed at how unsophisticated they were in comparison to his. He was very proud of his tunnel.
I'll bet. So this must be a process that takes weeks or months to complete, right? I mean, one person digging at a time with a shovel?
Yeah. It takes weeks and months. And soon they're beset by all sorts of problems. So the first problem they encounter is a leak. They dig into a burst pipe. The tunnel fills with water. They scoop thousands of gallons out using a hose that they borrow from a West Berlin fire station. They even go and ask for the help of the West Berlin water authorities, who come and help them fix it. So that's the first big problem. The second big problem is the tunnel is infiltrated by a Stasi spy, and that's really where the whole project is derailed and everything begins to fall apart.
So one of the diggers turned out to be working for the Stasi?
Yeah, so the other main character in my book, alongside Joachim Rudolph, who's the main digger, is a gay hairdresser. He's called Siegfried. He's 21 years old when we first meet him, and he's caught by the East Berlin authorities smuggling cigarettes. And he's taken in for questioning, and sitting there at the table questioning him is a Stasi official. And what's fascinating about the Stasi is that back then in the 60s, they had a target for the number of people that they were meant to recruit every year. So each employee was meant to recruit 25 informants, because the informants were really what set the Stasi apart from every other secret police force in history. They had, compared to the Gestapo in Hitler's Nazi Germany or the KGB in the Soviet Union, the Stasi had many, many more informants. So some estimates have it that as many as 1 in 6 people were working for the Stasi. And they called them rather poetically the breathing organs of the Stasi. Information is everything to them, and they rely on people to find it out. So when they catch Siegfried Usser, they set him a task of infiltrating these groups of students in West Berlin who help get people out of East Berlin. And he's very good. Siegfried is very good at it. He's charming. He's an extrovert. He goes out to bars and clubs, and gradually he finds out about this group of students digging a tunnel. He becomes friends with them. He convinces them that he's there to help. And he eventually finds out all about this tunnel, this plan to get, by that point, something like 85 people through this tunnel. And he tells his handler, someone called Lehman, everything. And after he tells them, the Stasi lay this trap. They send Stasi informants and tanks up to the border, ready to catch everyone just as they try to escape through the tunnel. Okay,
so they are aware of when the escape is going to happen, the day of, and they're just prepared to arrest anyone who arrives? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they're literally like, spiders waiting for flies in a web. So they surround the tunnel, and as each group of families or couples or students and nurses or vets, a whole range of people come up to escape, they just arrest them one by one off the streets. They take them to a variety of Stasi prisons where many of them are interrogated. And in the book, I lay out some of these interrogations word for word, and you can see the actual Stasi files that show what these interrogations were like. And the Stasi were brilliant at it. I mean, they'd learned that physical torture wasn't the best way of getting confessions, and they liked the idea that they were much more civilized than the Soviets who'd come before them and were barbaric in their interrogations. And the Stasi, they set up a college in Potsdam where they taught what they called operative psychology, which is all about how you extract information from people. And the main tool they used was sleep deprivation. And so one of the people that I interviewed who was arrested that night described to me in extraordinary detail what it was like sitting in a room, sitting on a stool for 12 hours at a time, no water, no food, sitting on your hands, constantly falling off the stool, being put back on again, falling off again, put back on again, ask the same questions again and again and again and again, night after night after night, until he eventually gave them everything.
My gosh, it's so awful to imagine these people who thought that they were finally making it out, finally going to be escaping this totalitarian nightmare here, and then just within a few feet of the escape tunnel, I guess they're snatched up and put in a van or hauled off to an interrogation like that. That's absolutely awful to imagine, for sure. And so it?
Yeah, and there's one story of a woman who was caught with her toddler, and she's questioned, and they say to her, unless you tell us everything, we will take your toddler away from you and put him in a children's home. And she's incredibly brave. She doesn't give up any information, and her toddler's taken away from her. And she's then in prison for the next 7 years, doesn't know what's happened to her child. And then there's an amazing story about how she gets out and she discovers that her incredible mother, so the toddler's grandmother, has searched through every single children's home in East Germany till they found the child, and they managed to get the child back.
Wow. So they were reunited in the end 7 years later?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they were reunited.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's wonderful they came together again, but that's incredible. And she was just trying to escape for the benefit of the child as well, of course. But
absolutely.
That's awful. So the initial tunnel, did they capture all 85 of the people who intended to leave, or did some of them slip the
No, yes. Some of them escaped. Yeah, some of them escaped and were then tried again 3 months later tried again 1 month later. But a number of them were caught. But crucially, they didn't catch the tunnelers, the diggers. And there's this extraordinary moment, again recorded in the Stasi files, when the tunnelers, so Joachim and the two others, they break up into this cottage. They hack through into this living room where they were told to expect all the people to have assembled, ready to crawl through the tunnel. And instead of finding those people waiting for them, they see Stasi soldiers out of the window. And then there's a Stasi file that records the moment that these Stasi soldiers are looking at Joachim through a crack in the door, and they're just about to burst in to take him and arrest him, when suddenly they hear one of the tunnelers talk about a machine gun, because the tunnelers were armed. They didn't want to be caught by the Stasi. They would prefer to have died in a shootout than be caught by the Stasi. And the Stasi soldiers, they only had Kalashnikovs, so they know that those Kalashnikovs are no match for Western machine guns. So they suddenly pause. They don't go in. They wait for backup. And as they're waiting for backup, Joachim and the others suddenly hear a message over their walkie-talkies from the rest of their crew back along the tunnel, who are waiting for them in West Berlin, and they're saying, come back, come back. You know, we've been caught, the Stasi are there. And they crawl all the way back through the tunnel just in time, just before the Stasi then burst into the room, run down, look down into the tunnel, but they're too late, and the tunnelers get away, ready to try again.
Wow, so the tunnelers were nearly caught as well, and only that errant comment that was overheard is what saved Joachim as well.
Exactly.
Incredible close call there.
Yeah.
So despite this complete disaster with the first tunnel, that doesn't really stop them in the end, right? They just go back to work, don't they?
They are. So there were so many times when I'd say to Joachim, at this point, surely, why didn't you give up? And he's this incredible human being that was never an option to him. And so they continue, they get back to the digging, and all the time, and this is the other twist in this story, they are being filmed by an American TV news crew, NBC. So this all goes back to this a man who's a fantastic character called Reuven Frank. He's this hotshot TV news producer, helped to invent so many of the principles of TV news that we all know today. And back in the 60s, he happened to be in Berlin the day the Berlin Wall went up. And as he watched people waving to each other over the barbed wire, he thought to himself, right, I want to find a way of telling the story to really make sense of it to people back in the US. And he instructs his correspondent on the ground, a man called Piers Anderton. He says to him, right, I need you to find an escape story. I want you to find a group of people who are trying to escape, and I want you to film it all as it happens, every twist and turn, not knowing how it would end. And partly because Reuven Frank, wanted to win the ratings battle between NBC and CBS for a time of intense rivalry between the main networks. And his correspondent in Berlin finds out about this group of student diggers. And they make a deal. NBC say, right, we'll give you money. We'll give you $7,500 if you let us film everything. And it's one of the most controversial decisions in TV news because they agree. They make this deal. They sign it. I've got a copy of the document in the book. And the reason it's so controversial is that it's back in the middle of the Cold War. It's one of the most dangerous years. There's nuclear war fever in the US. People are building their own bunkers. And here now you have American journalists crawling around in tunnels underneath the wall, filming what's going on. And, one stray shot or one shootout involving those American journalists could have ended up anywhere. Berlin was the flashpoint of the world at that point.
Right. So they're getting directly involved, and they're enabling and facilitating this tunnel, which could again end in disaster, or even worse, in the death of the people that they're funding. Right. So they're not just neutral observers or anything. They're not just watching the news. They're making the news happen in some ways. It's one perspective on that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, anyone who, journalists will understand that, will all know that that's sort of breaking one of the most fundamental rules of journalism, that you observe, you don't get involved. And he was very strict, Reuven Frank was, about saying, we're there to film, we should never get involved. But as people will see in the book, they eventually do. They eventually get sucked in on the final day, the day of the escape. They end up helping because how could they not? They've seen these diggers sweating, breaking their backs, covered in blisters for months on end in this tunnel. And when they're so close and they just need a final few bits of help from the news network, they can't help but give in and resist and give that help.
I'll bet. I'm sure that the crew was completely just emotionally invested at that point. As how long, in fact, did they spend with the diggers? How long did they film this documentary for?
So they started filming in May, and the final escape attempt, the successful attempt, happens in September. So that's May, June, July, August, September. That's 4 months. They film for 4 months. And it's these two brothers, Peter and Klaus Sturmer, and they go in, they take a tiny Arriflex camera, which is only big enough to hold 1.5 minutes of film. So it's incredibly laborious. They're down there filming. They film for 1.5 minutes, and they have to take the camera out of the plastic bag that it's in to protect it from the mud, reload a new film, and then begin filming again. Wow. And the other brother holds the light. There's not enough space down for a sound recorder, so you don't hear anything apart from this one time they take down a microphone, and it's this incredible moment where you can hear the footage of the footsteps above them. So you can hear women's footsteps, even the sound of their high heels. You can hear trams running along the ground above them, buses running, and you realize just how close they are and just how close they were to the Vopos who were just patrolling above their heads. And they would, every day the diggers would lie there flat on their backs in this space the size of a coffin, just terrified that they would see the ground above their heads ripped open, and there would be a flash or an explosion of dynamite, and that would be the final thing they would see before the end. And that was their daily fear, digging there and filming there.
That is so hard for me to imagine, because they know exactly what can happen, because it has already happened to them once before, but they just went back to work afterwards.
Yeah, incredibly brave.
So going back to the first tunnel attempt, did they learn that Siegfried had been collaborating with the Stasi? How did they maintain their operational security for the second tunnel attempt?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they don't know that it's him. The only person who works out that it was him is stuck in a Stasi prison. And he works it out one night when he's going back over his interrogations, and he's he knows that there's something that doesn't sit right, that there is something that didn't feel right, and he realizes what it is. He realizes that the Stasi interrogator asked about every single person involved in the operation, apart from Siegfried, this gay hairdresser. So he figures it out, but he can't tell them. And Siegfried manages to spin a line so that no one suspects him. But the problem is that because he was so heavily involved in the first operation, that the group of tunnelers say, well, you better not be too involved in the second one, just in case there are any Stasi spies who've been watching you. So they end up slightly freezing him out. So he finds out a few details. He finds out roughly where it is. He finds out roughly how long it is. And he passes all those details on to the Stasi handler. But they don't know enough to stop it. And ironically, and this is, again, another big irony in this story, because he doesn't know about it, because he doesn't tell the Stasi, and because that second escape attempt is successful, that means he's never outed as a spy. And so that meant that for years after that, he was able to carry on spying on all sorts of operations in West Berlin. And he alone, that one spy alone, is responsible for 89 arrests for people involved in all sorts of escape attempts. He was one of the most productive spies the Stasi ever had in West Berlin.
Wow. And all of this is because he was caught smuggling or stealing cigarettes so many years before that? So they really...
Exactly.
He wasn't just someone caught between a rock and a hard place. It sounds like he really took very well to this job as an informant then.
Well, this is fascinating. And I would say this is the other strand that I really dug into in the book, that I found the relationship between him and his handler really, really interesting. That you had this 21-year-old who up until that point had been this very soft character. He was into drawing and poetry, and he loved just going out and drinking cognac. And at that moment, he was, the threat in the back of the threat, the spoken threat was the threat of prison. He was gay, homosexual was illegal back then in East Germany. And it was very much, if you don't come and spy for us, you'll end up in jail. But what's so interesting is that a lot of people who were recruited by the Stasi against the threat of blackmail, they would find ways of resisting. They would find ways of just being a not very good spy, never having their own ideas, never really finding out much information. But Siegfried, he got a taste for it and he enjoyed it. And there's a moment there's a particular Stasi file, which is the file of his interrogation, the first moment he's recruited. And that goes on for something like 8 hours through a night. And it's in the seeds of that, it's in the description and the dialogue that goes on in that interrogation that I think I began to work out why it was that he was willing to go so far. And I think I'll leave that for the book, because it's a fascinating bit of astute psychology that the Stasi managed to play with him.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to reading that myself. I've already ordered a copy of your book, but it hasn't come in yet. So I'm looking forward to diving into that as well. So back to the tunnel, you mentioned that the second attempt is successful. So did they do anything differently, or was it just that because they froze out Siegfried, he wasn't able to pass along enough information to the Stasi?
Yeah, it's that, and they're much more secretive this time round. So the first time round, too many people know about it. The second time round, they are much more secretive. They only tell a few details to a few people in the inner circle. They are also blessed with an incredibly brave messenger. She's the girlfriend of one of the diggers, a woman called Ellen with incredible flaming red hair. She volunteers to go into East Berlin because there were no phone lines between East and West Berlin. So when they wanted to tell everyone in East Berlin the details of the escape and where they had to get to crawl through the tunnel, the only way they could do that was by telling someone with a West German passport who could go into East Berlin, knock on all the doors and give people various signals. So this girlfriend, she's incredibly brave. She goes to various pubs, gives various coded signals by buying matches and asking for drinks of water, which are the pre-established signals to show all the people watching that the tunnel is ready. And then these groups of people, families, couples, make their way to this cellar, which is on a street parallel to the street with a wall that runs down it. And one by one, they crawl into that tunnel, and they crawl 12 minutes. It takes 12 minutes to crawl from East Berlin to West Berlin. And there's this footage, the footage that NBC film of the first woman who makes it through. And it's the most spine-tingling piece of footage I have ever seen. So first thing you see is her white handbag, that it just her hand comes through the tunnel. The white handbag appears. Then you see her face, and she's beautiful. It's called Evie. And you see her then crawl out, and her toddler comes behind her. She's being held by one of the diggers. And Evie then climbs up the ladder. She faints at that point, and one of the cameramen runs forward to catch her. And then you see her sitting in the cellar, now in West Berlin, and she's wiping all the mud off her toddler's legs. And it's just phenomenal that, this is 1961. It's a kind of real life documentary making that feels so incredibly modern. It's reality TV.
That is so intense. It's hard to imagine the emotions in that cramped little space right there as she realizes that she's made it out with her child, and no telling what the future might hold. I'm assuming they've come out without any personal items or anything like that at all, but they are free now for sure. She and her child together.
Exactly. And yeah, you're right. I mean, most of them just have one bag. She has a handbag, and in that she has a bit of money, her ID card, and some nappies, and that's it.
Oh, wow. So how many people made it through this tunnel in the end? I know they were going for 85 the first time around.
Yeah, so this time 29 people come through. So that's where the tunnel gets its name from, 29 people. So it's called Tunnel 29.
Oh, okay.
And amazingly, they keep it a secret for the next few days because they at first they have an idea that they might try and get a few more people out. But eventually the tunnel falls in, and the story then makes its way onto the front pages of newspapers all over the world. And meanwhile, Reuven Frank, the hotshot producer, flies to Berlin to get all the footage. He lovingly edits it, takes it back to New York, where the film is then banned by President Kennedy's White House because they're terrified that it might inflame relations with the Soviet Union. And Reuven Frank is so crushed that he resigns. He's incredibly depressed because he's seen the edited film and he knows that it would just have this huge effect on audiences all over the US. But after 3 months, the crisis, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis is averted, and President Kennedy's White House eventually agrees to let the film be broadcast because NBC reassure them that they've done due diligence, they've anonymized the diggers, they've blurred their faces, so they won't be in danger. And the film is broadcast into American homes, and 17 million homes tune in to watch it. And the reviews are unlike anything he expects. So the Boston Globe called it unparalleled in the history of television. And it wins countless number of Emmys. And the US Information Department, they even buy hundreds of copies and screen them all over the world. And there's a rumor that even President Kennedy watches it and he's moved to tears. So this film becomes this really revolutionary moment in the history of TV newsmaking.
Oh, I can imagine. I've seen the footage myself, and it's quite incredible. What an incredible documentary for sure.
It's stunning.
So, do the people then? Do they just make new lives for themselves? The 29 that made it through. Were you able to interview any of them for the book or for the podcast?
Yeah, I interviewed a lot of them for the podcast. I spent months tracking down some of them. Some of them were harder to find than others, and in a way, the aftermath of what happens is just as fascinating as the events that lead up to it. I follow the story of two of them who ended up in prison. I follow what happens to them during prison, the incredible resistance group that one of them joins, the coded letters they write to each other, the extraordinary way in which one of them is released in this revolutionary prisoner swap, the very first prisoner swap that happens. And then there's Joachim's story, and his story has just the most beautiful, poignant ending. Again, I don't want to give that away because it is just so special and unexpected. And when I discovered it, it was one of those sort of spine-tingling moments that you don't forget because it's just beautiful. And so, yeah, and I then follow the story right up to 1989 and the fall of the wall, and really tracking up to now, and how, for many people who were born in East Germany, like Joachim, who live in Berlin today, he still says that when he meets people of his generation, he can still tell which of them were born in East Germany, which of them were born in West Germany. They call it Mauer im Kopf, which is the wall in the head, which for many Germans still exists. The wall was up for 28 years, and it takes a long time for the psychological effects of that to disappear.
Wow, that's hard for me to imagine. Honestly, I'd never heard that term before, but that is really fascinating how it leaves its indelible mark on the rest of your life.
Yeah.
This decision, this very short-sighted decision by one manipulative bureaucrat in East Germany that really just spans out over decades and leaves a permanent mark on the lives of everyone who's entrapped by this wall, whether the wall comes down or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, wonderful. This is such a great story. I'm really looking forward to getting into the book. And I know that you cover a lot of topics that we could never cover in just a hour-long podcast or something. So I'm very excited about this. I really appreciate you coming on today. Can you tell us where people can find your book? Actually, is it available now? I pre-ordered it a few days ago, but is it available for sale everywhere right now?
Oh, thank you. So in the US, it comes out. So yeah, so you can buy this book from tomorrow, from August the 24th. It will be available. It's called Tunnel 29: The True Story of an Extraordinary Escape Beneath the Berlin Wall. And actually the photograph on the front of the book is of the actual tunnel. So it's kind of fascinating to see that. And as I was saying in this interview, the really exciting thing in this book is that anyone who buys it can see photographs of the tunnel, but also read for themselves these original Stasi files, some of them handwritten by the Stasi informant. So there's a real sense of just looking at this first-hand history themselves.
Great. I'm very, very excited about this. Well, thank you so much, Helena. This has been really educational for me, and I'm very much looking forward to getting into the book. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. Really love the conversation. Thanks.
Oh, can I ask, do you have anything else in the works? What are you going to be doing now that the book is done?
Well, very excitingly, there's a TV series in the works. So it's being made by the same production company that made Chernobyl. So that is being scripted right now and hopefully should appear on screen sometime in the next few years. So that's the next project.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, if it's anything like the quality of Chernobyl, then I know it's going to be riveting for sure. So I have very high expectations and high hopes for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited.
Well, congratulations on that. That is fantastic news for sure.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me on. Just really, really fantastic questions and really good to have the conversation.
All right. Thank you, Helena.
All right. All the very best.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101 or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including Mark F. and Nicholas B. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.